Hi everybody. In this video, we're going to talk about Alison Jaggar's article, Love and Knowledge. Let me share the screen with you here. Okay. Before we start on the actual article, I'd like to define two different senses of the word reason, just to be clear. Now, in the first definition of reason, I'd like to talk about reason means a basis for explaining or justifying a belief, action, opinion, or event. So traffic was the reason that she was late this morning would be an example. Also, I'm sure he has a reason for being upset. So in this sense, reason is referring to a supportive statement for something else being the case. The second sense of reason is the power to think logically and reach conclusions. That is, human beings are creatures of reason. Jaggar uses the term reason in this second sense throughout this article, and I think it's important to remember this distinction. So Alison Jaggar was born in 1942. She got her PhD at the University of Buffalo in 1970. She joined the faculty at University of Colorado Boulder in 1990. She holds a joint appointment with the Women and Gender Studies at the same university. She's college professor of distinction. College professor of distinction and a research coordinator at the Center for the Study of Mind and Nature at the University of Oslo, Norway. She begins her article by stating that in the Western philosophical tradition, reason has been regarded as indispensable to knowledge, and emotions have usually been considered subversive of knowledge. Subversive, of course, means that they take away or that they underlie and make unstable reason. So emotions are antagonistic to knowledge. They take away from knowledge. Typically, the rational has been contrasted with the emotional, and the two linked with other dichotomies, that is, the universal versus the particular. These are the opposites, or have been seen as opposites in Western civilization and tended to for a long time. Cultural versus natural, public versus private, and male versus female. Even when emotions have been valued, they have been thought to need reason to guide them. Starting in the 17th century, emotions have been seen as non-rational urges that sweep the body. Emotions happen to an individual, something she suffered rather than did. In this paper, Jaggar wishes to suggest that emotions may be helpful and even necessary to the construction of knowledge. Emotions are necessary for human survival. They prompt us to act appropriately, to approach some situations and avoid others, to caress or cuddle, fight or flee. Without emotion, human life would not have meaning, argues Jaggar. Emotions are accepted in suggesting scientific hypotheses, right? Suggesting the hypotheses to be studied. This is because the logic of discovery, is what she and others have called this in philosophy of science, is thought to be more open than the logic of justification, where emotions are not considered to be valuable at all. They are in justifying or giving support for positions in science and in knowledge in general. Emotions are thought to take away or be subversive of knowledge. But values cannot be eliminated. Even in science, they are implicit. That means within the identification of problems to investigate. Hypothesis selection worthy of testing, and what solutions are accepted. What she calls the ideal of dispassionate inquiry is an impossible dream. The scientific method incorporates values and emotions. So the idea here is that there's an ideal here that we can be dispassionate in how we search for knowledge in our scientific endeavors. But one of the problems with this is that it's really kind of a myth, that there really is no way to completely separate reason from emotion, even in something considered to be so reason-oriented as the natural sciences. But perhaps even more in the social sciences and certainly other endeavors, this idea of being dispassionate, of being able to not consider one's values, is not even possible. And so it's not that she's saying that we should allow whatever emotions we're feeling to bias us when we do science. What she's saying is that implicit in everything we do, there already are biases, and we need to accept that and deal with it. Now, certainly we want to be as unbiased as we can in our sciences, but at least if we stop sort of lying to ourselves, following this myth that it's possible to reach a kind of ideal, or at least close to an ideal, as long as we try to convince ourselves of this, we are going to be further away from the truth rather than closer to it. She's not a cultural relativist here. She's not arguing that all of our abilities to have knowledge are just simply based on our own emotions or on our cultural practices and beliefs. She's rather saying that emotion and value is inherent in all of our activities, even our scientific pursuits, and that we need to recognize that and deal with it. Okay. We must construct, Jaggar says, conceptual models that demonstrate knowledge and emotion as mutually constitutive, okay, or constitutive. That means that a conceptual model is a way of looking something. It's simply a way of understanding something. And so we need to construct a conceptual model not on the ideal of dispassionate inquiry, but rather in an acknowledgement, a conceptual model that accepts that knowledge is going to necessarily involve emotion and be constituted by emotion as well as reason. And the even further problem with the ideal of dispassionate inquiry is that, like all myths, it is a form of ideology that fulfills certain social and political functions. By the way, if some of this language is new to you, I suggest that you look up some of these words. For instance, ideology is a very important word. It doesn't just mean ideas in general. An ideology is a sort of a collection of ideas that form a kind of a group of beliefs that cohere and tend to orient people as believing certain things are true. Race, class, and gender, Jaggar argues, shape every aspect of our lives. Reason is associated with members of dominant groups, whereas emotion is associated with members of subordinate groups. Now, what are these subordinate groups that she's talking about? What are these dominant groups she's talking about? Subordinate groups are people of color, women, disabled, old people, sometimes young people. They really are groups that are not the part of the dominant social group. She and other feminists that have a similar idea, they argue that social groupings help determine one's identity, and the social group of rich white men is a dominant social group in our culture, in our society, in the West, Europe as well as the United States, so that what she'll say is that the norms, the practices, and the very beliefs that are passed on from generation to generation in Western culture tend to serve the interests of rich white men. Okay. Emotionality of women is a familiar cultural stereotype, but women appear to be more emotional than men because required to express emotion more openly. Think of how little girls are brought up to be more expressive of emotion. This is what Jaggar would argue. Emotionally inexpressive women are suspect as not being real women. Now, for modern Western men, it's different. Modern Western men are required to present a kind of coolness, a lack of excitement, even boredom. They're allowed to express emotion only for trivial events. The ideological function of the myth, therefore, of the dispassionate investigator. The dispassionate means like the not passionate, the purely reason-oriented, sort of rigidly logical scientist is what she's talking about here. The ideological function, in other words, the ideology that she's talking about is the ideology of the dominant group, which is to do everything to serve its own interests, and that is to bolster the authority of these dominant groups and discredit the observations of subordinate groups. Let me say at this point that when she says things like the ideological function of the myth is to bolster authority and discredit observations, she doesn't mean that all of this is like planned out and talked about behind closed doors like some kind of conspiracy. It comes out sounding that way, and I think that's one reason that sometimes folks will dismiss this kind of direct analysis of society as being very radical, because we don't tend to talk this way. But the point is not that there are a bunch of mean guys somewhere talking all this over and figuring all this out and trying to take advantage of everyone. In fact, the point is they don't have to do that. Men don't have to do that, because it's built into the way the structure of society is set up. In other words, the structure of society is set up to benefit rich white men. They don't have to do it on purpose. The norms and values of the society are set up. They are in existence and passed on to benefit rich white men. It's not something that has to be planned out. This is a kind of oppression. Oppression, if you think of oppression as, in this sense, as holding down, sort of oppressing, pressing down of subordinate groups for the benefit of dominant groups, which again is a systematic, structural problem for the most part. We're not talking about necessarily, we're not talking about individual acts of racism, sexism, and so on, so much, although those are very important and very, almost everybody would agree that those are very bad things. But the real difficult thing to grasp is not the individual people with what's sometimes called overt oppression or overt racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on. The hard thing to grasp, because we understand individuals, bad apples, and so on. The really difficult thing that Jaggar would argue is hard to grasp, is this systematic nature. In other words, built into the practices that are already in existence, the way things are done. This is the way things have always been done. You may hear that. It's tradition. When we conserve our ways of doing things, those ways of doing things in a society stretch back and back and back. And so think about what's happened back and back and back in history, and it might become something to think about. Have we conserved practices that themselves are inherently racist, sexist, homophobic, and so on, so that even someone who was the kindest, nicest, non-racist, non-sexist person in their own individuality could nevertheless unwittingly perpetuate the social level, the structural practices that oppress groups. So, the more forcefully, and this is interesting, the more forcefully the latter groups, that the subordinate groups, express their observations and claims, the more easily they are discredited. Well, why? Well, the myth of dispassionate investigator, right? This idea that real knowledge is attained only through kind of a rigid, calculating reason without emotion being present, promotes the silencing of women, defined culturally as the bearers of emotion, and perceived, this is women, are perceived as more subjective than men, as more biased and irrational. It's thought to be human nature, right? That's built into this whole myth around women being less than. She focuses on women, although this oppression, this silencing, she argues, continues on through most all oppressed groups. So the ideal of the dispassionate investigator, she says, is a classist, racist, and masculinist myth. Okay, remember, this is a social level. She's not talking about individuals evilly sitting behind closed doors, working all this out. People in society could be the nicest people in the world on an individual level. Okay. So in a hierarchical society, right? Arguably, we have a hierarchical society. Capitalist, just by its nature, the capitalists own the means of production. The laborers are those who sell their labor power for as little as the capitalists can get away with paying. That's just part of it. That's part of the game, as they say. The more forcefully the latter groups, in a hierarchical society, the norms and values will tend to serve the interests of the dominant groups. In a capitalist, male-dominated society, the predominant values will tend to serve the interests of rich white men. Consequently, we will all tend to develop an emotional constitution consistent with those interests. So we will all, her point here is that all of us, whether rich white men or people of color, or by the way, the term people of color, which will be used occasionally in this this presentation, this article, sometimes students will recognize, and sometimes folks will hear the term people of color and thinks that's just a variation of the term, the antiquated term colored people. Now, it may not make a lot of sense to some folks. Why? But the term colored people is an old-fashioned, considered to be derogatory designation. So if one wants to be culturally sensitive, then colored people would be not something to say as a reference to. However, people of color is accepted. For Black people is still accepted, and Although the way the terminology usually works, it's the way that the trend in speaking about different groups, like disabled people, is considered to be old-fashioned as well. A person who is disabled, or a person who has a mental disorder, rather than a mentally disordered, the mentally disordered. When you point to the person themselves, a blank person is better than referring to the whole group, or just lumping somebody into a group. Anyway, that might be of interest to some folks that have not encountered this this way of talking. Of course, if you don't care about the convention, then whatever you want to say is up to you. So we all develop. Let's see here. So we all develop emotional constitution consistent with visceral racism, homophobia, ambitious and competitive emotions, and contempt for women. Now, she says everyone in the society is subject to these emotions, these feelings, these evaluations. Even the people that are the receivers of the negative end of these terms are going to tend to have these same values. That's what can make one so conflicted, and can be something that is very uncomfortable for folks that that are on the negative end of these terms, to put it lightly. The dominant values will be implicit, like inside, right? Just without us being able to even see them. The dominant values will be implicit in our gut level responses. They limit our capacity for outrage. They lend credibility to the belief that greed and domination are inevitable human emotions. They blind us to the possibility of alternative ways of living. But people do not always experience the conventionally acceptable emotions. They may not feel satisfaction when their leaders make fools of themselves, they may feel satisfaction when their leaders make fools of themselves, resentment for welfare payments, they may be attracted to forbidden modes of sexual expression. They may feel revulsion for socially sanctioned ways of treating children or animals. She calls these outlaw emotions. These outlaw emotions are often experienced by subordinated individuals who pay a high price for maintaining the status quo. For instance, people of color might experience anger over a racist joke rather than just, oh, well, or trying to laugh it off. Women who are subjected to male sexual banter may become uncomfortable or afraid rather than flattered. So you see the emotions going on here are called outlaw emotions in Jaggar's terminology, because they run counter, the emotions that are felt run counter to the dominant group, the sort of way you're supposed to react. So if somebody just gets angry over a racist joke, then they're not going along. Just relax. The people who tell such jokes might say, just relax. Male sexual, that's just guys being guys, right? So, women should just get over it. It's just boys being boys. So women who don't want to get over it, don't get over it, who want to honor the feelings that arise in them, this is what Jaggar would call outlaw emotions. They're outlaw because they're counter to the dominant norms. Such people who experience outlaw emotions may be confused or think there is something wrong with them. But when shared or validated by others, the basis exists for forming a subculture defined by perceptions, norms, and values that oppose the prevailing perceptions, norms, and values. Outlaw emotions are distinguished by their incompatibility with the dominant perceptions and values. Only when we reflect on our initially puzzling emotional responses may we bring to consciousness our gut level awareness that we are in a situation of coercion, cruelty, injustice, or danger, and to challenge the status quo. But how do we know when emotions should be accepted rather than rejected? Emotions are appropriate, Jaggar says, when they are characteristic of a society in which all humans thrive. Emotions are appropriate if they are conducive to establishing such a society. So joy is appropriate when we are developing our creative powers. Anger and disgust appropriate where humans are denied their full creativity and freedom. So this is a kind of a basis for a morality here, a kind of a moral objectivism rather than a moral relativism. She's not arguing on a full-scale moral theory, but she is saying, let's start with making our chief value for morality, acting in ways that are conducive to establishing a society where all humans thrive. So emotional responses of subordinated people in general are more likely to be appropriate than those of the dominant class. They're more likely to incorporate reliable appraisals of situations. Okay, I'm a little behind there, sorry about that. Than those of the dominant class. They should not be uncritically accepted, but women have a special advantage. They seem to have a special advantage both in understanding the mechanisms of domination in society and envisioning freer ways to live. Now, one term that went by up there, let me go back here. An epistemological privilege. The idea of epistemological privilege is, you may recall that epistemology is the study of what we know and how we know it. So epistemological, you can just, when you see that term, you can just think it's about knowledge, right? Questions about knowledge. So epistemological privilege encapsulates the idea that some people have a privileged position in life to know more than other people do. And so the idea here is that there's a position, a social location, if you will, that subordinate individuals have because they have been oppressed in our society, that from the position that they're in, they've had such more enhanced, if you will, experience with the shortcomings of our society, with the truly awful inequalities in our society over and over again, that because of their social location, because their identities have put them in a position to be constantly harassed or constantly silenced, that they know more of what's wrong with society than people in the dominant group, right? Think about how, as a white male, now I'm not rich, but as a white male, I have rarely had to think about violence when I walk to a car, a parking lot, as it's getting dark outside. I can't say that it's never happened, of course. Such situations can be scary, especially if there's not anybody around. But whatever I have felt would pale in comparison to what most women have felt, perhaps all women have felt, when they walk alone to a parking lot as it's getting dark. Their social position as women have their social position in that because they're women, they fall into a position in society where society tends to treat them as inferior, as people to be manipulated or used in the Kantian sense as means rather than as ends, as people subject to violence in a way that that there's not a huge amount of outrage when violence is committed against, in many cases, against women, so that the terror that is felt by a lot of women is so much greater than what most white men, I would say, have had to go through, puts them in a social location. If you think of society as having a kind of geography and what role you have in society, what identity or social group you belong to, puts you in a location within that geography, then the point is that subordinate groups, social groups who have encountered all this, a lot of oppression, have a certain privilege, actually, in knowing what is truly wrong and unequal in society. So that's epistemological privilege. Very, very interesting concept there, very interesting idea, and maybe important for when we think about, if Jaggar is right here, it may be important when thinking about voting for leaders. We want people who have knowledge, and it could be that people from subordinate groups have another kind of knowledge that, say, you know, your white male politician doesn't have and couldn't really have, except second or third hand at best. So she says, lastly, in terms of outlaw emotions, that these outlaw emotions should not be uncritically accepted, even though women have a special advantage in understanding domination and envisioning freer ways to live. It is important that outlaw emotions are critiqued and not just whatever a person happens to feel will be the right thing. Jaggar is just arguing that there are such things as outlaw emotions. Now, whether any particular outlaw emotion is justified depends on a critique of the surrounding beliefs that go into generating that particular emotion. So, a couple of questions to think about as you do this reading, either again or for the first time, or just as you go away from this presentation. Does race, class, and gender shape every aspect of our lives? Is reason associated with some groups but not others? I think for myself, when I'm looking at this, does race, class, and gender shape every aspect of our lives? Well, I certainly don't tend to think so. But then again, I do come from a race, class, and gender, or at least race and gender, that does tend to arguably be in the dominant social group. So maybe it would be easy for someone like me to think that my position is just sort of a normal one rather than something that has shaped my life. And two, are the outlaw emotions of subordinate groups good indicators of truths not understood by the dominant group, or not tending to be understood by the dominant group? I don't think Jaggar thinks that people in the dominant group can't understand outlaw emotions. Now, it may be pointless to argue whether they can understand them as much as the people who have experienced them firsthand, probably. But I think that she could hold, I think she would hold that outlaw emotions are emotions that anyone could potentially have, but that they would probably tend to be more intense for someone actually in a subordinate group. So I hope that this presentation has helped you understand this fascinating article. So thank you for listening. I will stop sharing here and say goodbye for now. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.